Welcome, NASCAR fans and On Pit Row magazine readers. This is our weekly update to the magazine and our weekly version of Dan Beaver's NASCAR Fantasy Pit Stop that we do every week, where Dan updates everybody on the race coming up this particular week. And we're going to Martinsville, the famous paperclip. How you doing, Dan? I'm Charlie Turner, by the way, and he's Dan Beaver down in Texas. How are you, Dan?
I'm doing good. Just a little sad that season's coming to an end, but it'd be nice if had a few weeks off. But if otherwise, this made it all the way through the winter.
Or at least we have a race that you and I both, at a racetrack that you and I both love this week, which helps with everything. I know you still have the pressures of what you have to do to advise people on how they're going to make their picks and things, and we're getting down to crunch time for those people who are in contention to win their championships in their league. So this is a big deal, and this race is, I would think, one of the ones that's probably a little bit difficult to pick, although it's more predictable than the one we had last week at Talladega, right?
Yeah, actually, this is probably one of the easier races to pick, but it doesn't always do you a lot of good when that happens, because there are 3 or 4 drivers that are kind of no-brainers. When that happens, everybody's got them on your roster, so you don't have any differentiators. So the trick this week is going to be looking is not in predicting that Jimmy Johnson, Jeff Gordon, Denny Hamlin are going to run strong. It's going to be looking to see who's going to finish in that 5th to or 6th to 12th place range, and those are the guys that are actually going to make a difference for you this week.
Yeah, this is a dark horse race, right? Because there's a lot of popular picks, so you're trying to find that guy that will sneak up on everybody and put your, you're not going to maybe pick up 20 points on people, but you want to pick up those 5 or 6 for the one you get that is the differentiator, right?
Yeah, and I wouldn't call it a dark horse race, maybe a dim horse race.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
You don't usually get those guys that are running back in the 30s, running in the 20s. But sometimes you get the guys that are running in the 20s, running in the teens, and that makes the difference.
Okay, so it's up to you. Let's start with as we always do in this show, we'll start with the salary cap type games. Where are you going to go this week? Where do you start? Start at the bottom this time, or you go to start at the top? I mean, everybody's going to have the guys at the top, so you kind of start there, I guess.
Well, you recognize that's probably the case, and if you've got Jimmy Johnson, you've got Jeff Gordon, there's no reason to get rid of them and make up a lot of room at the top of the grid or the top of the salary cap range, because they probably are going to finish in the top 5. If they don't, it's going to be something odd, like Jeff Gordon getting caught up in that accordion style accident in spring, or Brad Keselowski getting run over in pit road. Not a top 5 contender necessarily, but a good solid top 10 driver who got derailed by something that happened to him. So you need to be aware that that's probably still going on at the top. The drivers that finished in the top 5 in the spring, in the top 5 in this race last year, are probably the ones that are going to finish there again. And you just kind of play status quo with them. Then you look for good bargains. You look for people that are good in this type of situation. Martinsville and the short tracks in general and short flat tracks in general, which are 2 different track types to me, are both drivers' tracks. So you've got people that are going to do better than they normally would, because the equation of horsepower compared to driver skill gets skewed just a little bit. Horsepower, it's not that it's not important, but it's not quite as important, because you can't get all of it to the ground. You have to have, or in order to get all that horsepower to the ground, you really have to be able to navigate the corners well, back them up, nail the accelerator at the apex, and passes that are made in turns 1 and 3 are actually set up in turns 2 and 4. So you got to know that. The driver's got to have that ability. He's got to have that instinct. He's got to have that skill. And that changes for this track versus one of the similarly configured mile-and-a-half tracks, where you can kind of pick your style. You can either drive in hard and ease up in the middle of the corner and then nail the accelerator, or you can drive in easy, drive hard through the middle and exit at the corner. So this one, there's really only one way to do it right. You can't play around. You've got to find that right ability through the corners, and that's why it appears that for some drivers a switch is flipped, and once they start running well, they run well for a long period of time. Jimmy Johnson's 9 or so consecutive top fives, in which he had 5 victories between 2005 and 2009, is a good example. Jeff Gordon's got the same kind of streaks. Denny Hamlin's got the same kind of streaks. So when that switch flips, then they're good, often good for a long time, which is why you get streaks. Clint Bowyer has the longest active streak of top 10s at 5. He's a moderately priced driver, belongs on the roster if he fits. But then you've also got drivers like Eric Almirola, who swept the top 10 back in 2012, finished 8th this spring. He's a driver that probably is a good salary cap pick this week. Marcus Ambrose finished 8th and 5th in the last 2 spring races here. Didn't do quite as well last fall, but now that he's on his way out the door, he's probably got something to prove. He wants to go out with a bang, and I expect his results to be a little bit better on each track than his averages show. So he could be good for a top 10, and if not, a low teens finish, and that makes him a good salary cap value. So I think you recognize what's happening at the top, but then start to fill your roster from the middle and bottom, and stay away from bargain basement drivers. A driver like Reed Sorensen is not going to finish in the teens. He's going to finish somewhere in the high 20s, low 30s, and that caliber of driver, that caliber of team is going to be in that range. So stay away from the guys that you think of it as just flat-out dark horses, and look for the guys that you think of as good values instead.
The other thing we have in play here is this Martinsville race is the first race of the eliminator round of the chase, the last 3 race segment before the final race at Homestead. So there's a lot riding on this, obviously. How do you, when you talk about a driver like comparing, you mentioned Jimmy Johnson and Jeff Gordon at the top of the show. If you already have those 2 drivers on your roster, you're going to keep them both. But if you don't have both of those drivers and you're thinking about picking one of those drivers up, do you go more for Jimmy Johnson, who really has nothing? He has nothing to lose. I mean, Jimmy Johnson, I think, is going to try to prove that he should be in the chase by winning every race from here on out, and I predicted that on the On Pit Road Facebook or Hangout this couple days ago. But I mean, will somebody like Gordon? Gordon needs to, he wants to win, so he guarantees himself a slot in that last race. But he also has to guard against a terrible finish. Can't gamble too much. I mean, do you have a formula for this? Because this is the first time we've ever had to deal with this.
You might if this were Phoenix, and you run into a situation where fuel mileage comes into play. It's not going to come into play on a track like Martinsville, so there's not that same potential for a wild gamble. And in this specific case, the 2 desires kind of cancel each other out. Both drivers really want to win. Neither driver would lay over for the other in a situation at the end. Jimmy Johnson's not going to give up the position so that Jeff Gordon gets that guarantee into the championship round, and Jeff Gordon's not going to lay over so that Jimmy Johnson can protect his pride. So if those 2 are going head-to-head at the end, it's going to be whichever driver has the track position and has the best car in the final 50, 75, 100 laps. Both of them are probably going to be in the top 5, so it's probably going to be an issue. But I don't know that you can predict which one's going to finish ahead of the other. It's going to come down to that last adjustment. It probably is going to come down to a late race restart, and if that happens, you got to give the nod to Johnson, because Gordon, he's gotten a little bit better on restarts, but he's still probably one of the worst drivers on restarts. So you think in those terms, really, I think, more than you do desire. You might think in terms of desire when it comes to someone like Denny Hamlin, who has struggled with injury last year on short flat tracks, and that used to be his bread and butter. He would be no more than a dark horse this week because he struggled so badly on the minimally banked courses of 1 mile in length or less. But the added bonus or the added benefit of him knowing that this probably is his only year and maybe Phoenix, he's going to be trying. He's going to be there's going to be more desire there. There's going to be more willpower there to get to the front for him than there would be on another track. So it factors into your decision for someone like Denny Hamlin. Probably doesn't factor into your decision with Johnson or Gordon, because that's going to be a situational issue that you just can't predict.
How much do you like the two Penske cars this week at this racetrack?
It's hard not to like them everywhere at the moment. It's like Brad Keselowski in his championship, and say he's got a bad record here. This is not a good track for him. He shouldn't be started, and he'd go out and finish and contend for the win. Joey Logano's doing the same thing this year, and when he's on his A game, Brad Keselowski's doing the same thing this year. So it doesn't matter if this is a good track for them statistically or not. They're probably going to be strong just because they're having that kind of year. And both of them have been strong at New Hampshire short flat tracks. Logano's got the victory there just a few weeks back, and Brad Keselowski has been his principal rival on those tracks. So yeah, they're going to be good. But at this stage of the season, they're probably also among the most expensive drivers. If you're in a salary cap game and Brad Keselowski, Joey Logano, Kevin Harvick, and Jeff Gordon are not the most expensive drivers, either there's something seriously wrong with that game's formula, or they're doing it manually and the manager fell asleep at the wheel. So those are going to be the top drivers, and you're looking for someone else to finish in the top five, just outside the top five, other than those four.
All right. Well, before we get into the Yahoo game, and there'll be, I'm sure, a lot of different scenarios to consider there, because this driver allocation issue is, we're 4 races in, so there's a lot of people that are out of allocations for certain drivers. So we're going to talk about that. But before we do that, make sure follow Dan on Twitter if you're not already doing it. If you're a fantasy racer, sure you are, but Dan's Twitter handle is @FantasyRace. Follow him. You can follow me at On Pit Row if you'd like. I'm not going to help you in fantasy at all, but I'm kind of fun guy to follow. And then read Dan's very extensive fantasy racing articles at both yahoosports.com and rotoworld.com. Those are up every week. You want to make sure you get those and study them and use those along with information like we're giving you at this hangout this week to make your picks this week, because it's going to make you much more of a contender, and you'll get some bragging rights. If you're nothing, even if you're not contending for your championship, you're probably playing against somebody that you want to brag on, and Dan will help you do that. So that all aside, let's talk about the Yahoo game. Totally different deal than fantasy. At this early in the season, I think you can talk a lot about the same kinds of things when you're talking about the Yahoo game and a salary cap game, but when we get to this point, it's totally different, isn't it?
Well, and yeah, with the Yahoo game, you do have to set out you have to have a plan beginning with Daytona, and you've got to kind of stick with that plan as you go along. However, at the beginning of the year, you probably would have thought of Denny Hamlin as being a short flat track master, and you would have saved allocations for him for situations like this. If that were the case, and you used him on some of the 1 mile flat tracks, then you probably lost quite a few points. If you jumped on the bandwagon then for Keselowski and Logano, you got as many points probably in the beginning of the year as you would have if you'd have saved them up and used them now, but they're just not able to help you now on that stretch run. So you've got to look for that next level of driver that's actually going to help you. And there are some good closers. Typically, we talk about Jimmy Johnson being the best closer in the business, but it's hard to say that now after he's coming off 3 bad races that dropped him out of playoff contention. Not sure if he just had a run of bad luck or if there's something going on with that team. This is not a week that I would worry about that just yet. I would suspect that he had a run of bad luck, and he's going to be strong in the last 4 races. So if you saved allocations for Jimmy Johnson, you may as well use them here at Martinsville. We said this at Dover, we said this at Charlotte, and we're going to say it again And if it doesn't work out this time, hopefully we won't say it again. But if Jimmy Johnson cannot run well here, he didn't run well at Charlotte, he didn't run well at Dover. If he also can't run well here, then don't even think about him for the rest of the year. Something is seriously wrong with that team. And it doesn't mean that if he finishes badly, that's one thing. If he gets a penalty, that's one thing. But if he's not even contending for a top 5, if he doesn't lead laps at Martinsville, then there's something seriously wrong, and just write them off for the rest of the year. They could turn things around. There are no guarantees in NASCAR, and this is a sport that just has huge capacities to surprise us week in and week out. But there are trends, and Johnson definitely is showing a trend right now that says this is not the same team. Why it's not the same team is kind of up, for people like Bob Pockris and those guys, or some of the people that actually cover the race, Marty Smith, etc., to try to figure out exactly what it is, what dysfunction there is in that team. The only thing a fantasy player cares about is that it's happening, not why it's happening. So, in the Yahoo game, I've got Johnson on my roster right now, and I fully intend to start him unless he really struggles in practice. And if that happens, then I probably would use up a Jeff Gordon allocation. If that's not available, I might even try to use a dark horse pick and take Clint Boyer. So some of those things could change between now and the lock for the qualification lock. Jump down to Group B, and we've got the same issue there that we've had all year long. Brad Keselowski, Joey Logano are too good for their own good. They're so good that they become almost fantasy irrelevant because you've used them up. In this case, Denny Hamlin would be a dark horse. Last year or the year before last, he would have been a favorite. He should be a dark horse because he's been struggling on flat tracks, but now he's going to be a favorite again, just because I think he's got the desire to win, and he's been a little bit stronger in the chase than he has at other stages of the season. But that didn't work out for him very well at Richmond, didn't work out very well for him at New Hampshire, and those are two tracks that I think of as comparatives for this one, because they're flat, because Richmond's short, and since he struggled there, if it weren't for the fact that this is his one chance, his best chance to win, I probably would think of him as a dark horse rather than a favorite. Or if I had unlimited allocations for Keselowski and Logano, I would start them instead. Also down in Group A, Greg Biffle is not someone that you normally think of as a strong, short, flat track racer, but he entered this race in the spring, the STP 500, with a 3-race streak of top 10s and a 5-race streak of top 15s. At this stage of the season, a guaranteed top 15 would be worth starting a driver because of allocation management. He struggled a little bit and finished 18th in April. I think it was April. But that means that there wasn't a huge downside to starting him. He lost, maybe 6 points in the Yahoo game by finishing outside the top 15, and that makes him a driver that's worth mentioning. In a salary cap game, we talked about Eric Almirola, we talked about Marcus Ambrose. They're longer odds to finish in the top 10 than someone like Hamlin or Biffle, but they're good differentiators because they're not going to be terribly popular in the Yahoo games. So if you need to make up ground, you might roll the dice on them, or at least have them on your provisional roster so you can watch them in practice and qualification. And then if they run well in those sessions, you've got them to start. Down in Group C, now we've got Dillon and Larson. Again, the same problem with Logano and Keselowski. They've been so good that they've almost become fantasy irrelevant if you've exhausted them on your roster. If not, you could run the table with either of those two drivers or a combination of those two drivers and get the most points each week. Larson's always going to be better than Dillon in the last 4 races, in all likelihood. But if you don't, and you got to look for somebody else, then your next best drivers this week is Danica Patrick and Justin Allgaier, and they're about evil. They're about even. Both of them
evil?
have an.
I like that evil.
They can be. Danica definitely can be evil. Sometimes when you put your hopes on her and she spins out on these flat tracks. Well, they both have an average finish of 26.5, I think, in the first 6 races of this season on short flat tracks. Danica has had better races and worse races than Allgaier. Allgaier has been more consistent. So if you're looking for someone that's going to finish right around the, let's say, 17th to 22nd place mark, because you need to get as close as you can to Dillon and Larson this week, save them for another week. Those two drivers are probably going to finish somewhere in that range. Danica's more risky, but she could finish in the mid-teens. Allgaier is less risky, but he's probably going to finish around 20th. So it's risk-reward, and depends on how many allocations you have. In my case, I'd probably start Danica because I've got plenty of allocations. But also in my case, I've got plenty of allocations for Dillon and Larson remaining. I think I'm going to have to make one choice where they're not on my roster for the rest of the year. So I would run the table with them, but if I couldn't do that, I would use Danica.
Well, if you have 3 allocations of Dillon and Larson left, is this the race you'd take somebody else?
Maybe either this race or Phoenix. I think it's a bit of a toss-up. You definitely wouldn't do it at Texas or Homestead, even though Danica's a little bit better at Texas on the similarly configured 1.5-mile tracks than she is on other course types. She's not good enough to outrun Larson and Dillon. So that's where I'm saving those allocations for, and it comes down to deciding whether or not to do it, to use Danica or Allgaier on this track or Phoenix. So to hedge my bets, I think at the moment I've got probably Dillon and Patrick sitting on my roster. So if Patrick really looks good, I'll go ahead and activate her and take that bullet out of the gun. If she doesn't, then I'll go ahead and start Dillon and realize that I probably will have to start her or Allgaier at Phoenix.
How important? I mean, it's always important, but how important is practice and qualifying this week in both of these game types?
More so here than mini tracks. Martinsville's a rhythm track. If you don't roll off the hauler fast, you usually don't find a whole lot on the track. And if you haven't figured out how to approach the corners, it's probably not going to happen in race practice conditions. It tends to happen in single car practices when you can try different things. If you've got someone breathing down your neck, it's difficult to roll out of the accelerator, roll out of the throttle, entering the corner if you think you can get it run over. And if that's in the back of your mind, you're not going to get that rhythm down. So drivers who practice well tend to finish well here.
I didn't look to see if this was a weekend where we have all 3 series at Martinsville. I should have done that. But if that's the case, how important do you put? How much importance do you put on the performance of drivers who are running in the Cup Series race and how they do in say, a truck or nationwide series race at the same weekend? Does that role count? I mean, with Kyle Busch, it has in the past.
It has, but we don't have the nationwide series here, so it's the truck series.
I didn't think we did. I thought we have trucks and Cup, right?
And you might get Keselowski in that race. I haven't looked at the entry list, and you might get Kyle Busch in that race. And it doesn't really matter. Kyle Busch is going to dominate any truck race that he's in, so right. It doesn't always carry over into Cup. For Keselowski, the extra seat time might help a little bit, but I think it'll make more difference next week at Texas when you do have all 3 series running together, and then it's more that that extra gives you a little bit more comfort on the track and to see how the track's going to change. Here, not so much.
Anything else to watch this week that might help you picking the last 3 races?
No, not really. This is one race that kind of stands by itself. This race will help you out a little bit for Phoenix. So if you've got someone in the back of your mind for Phoenix, you might evaluate them here, whether or not they're on your provisional roster, even if they're not on your provisional roster. And I would think in the next 4 weeks in terms of 2 groups of 2. Martinsville and Phoenix are going to behave somewhat similarly, and even though it's not a similarly configured 1.5-mile track, Homestead and Texas will be somewhat alike. Homestead's a little unique because it's a true oval, because it's got progressive banking, but it is still a 1.5-mile track. So it takes some of that same balance of horsepower and handling that that you're going to experience at Texas. So Martinsville will help you out at Phoenix. Texas will help you out at Homestead. But you can't just run the table with all of the same drivers. Gordon, Johnson, Keselowski, Logano, Harvick are going to be strong in all 4 races, but other drivers will be situational.
All right. Any final thoughts about Martinsville before we close this one out this week?
Even if you're not there, just go get a thick slice of bologna and make yourself up a bologna sandwich. I think I was back there in 2008, 2009, and my cholesterol still spiked from eating bologna.
Did you eat one of those big red hot dogs? I haven't had one of those yet. I got to do that someday.
Yeah, I had 1 or 2 of those, and just so I could say I could, and or did. Yeah. And that may be one of the reasons that I became vegan for a while after that.
So. Okay, well, he is Dan Beaver. Make sure that if you're following Dan on Twitter, pay attention to him on race day and through qualifying. And if you have a question, send him a message because he will respond to you on Twitter, and you can get some firsthand information there. We'll be back next week to talk about talk about Texas and leading into that big 1.5-mile racetrack, fast track next week. But thank you all for joining us. Dan, thanks for your time tonight, and really good stuff as always. And we'll be back next week to talk Texas.